Some people get their revenge by planning it for years. Some people get it handed to them, out of nowhere, by a complete stranger, on a Tuesday morning, in a Facebook message. This is one of those stories. My business partner and I ran a private investigation firm together. Cheating spouses were our bread and butter. We'd seen every excuse, every alibi, every "it's not what it looks like" in the book. Nothing surprised us anymore. Until one morning, while we were packing up to leave town for a job, my partner's phone buzzed with a message from a man neither of us had ever heard of. Do you know a name? That name belonged to her stepfather. The man who, the moment he married my partner's mother and had kids of his own, shipped my partner off to boarding school and quietly erased her from the family. The man who had cost my partner her relationship with her own mother for the better part of 2 decades. What that stranger was about to tell us would hand my partner the one thing she never thought she'd get, a way back to her mom. Stick around for this whole story, because the ending, 4 words, delivered ice cold, is one of the most satisfying things I have ever witnessed in real life. If you're new here, welcome. I tell real stories about the moments people finally get the truth they've been denied for years, and what they do with it once they have it. This channel leans into slow burn, well-planned justice, not screaming matches. If that's your thing, subscribe, because today's story might be the best one I've ever covered. This one runs long, so settle in. Let's get into it. Every family has a story about the stepdad or the stepmom, the outsider who came in and changed everything. Most of the time, the stereotype is exaggerated. Most stepparents genuinely try their best in a complicated situation. This was not one of those cases. My partner, I'll call her Mara, was young when her mother remarried. Her mom's new husband, Craig, seemed fine at first. A little distant, maybe, but fine. That changed fast once Craig and Mara's mother had children of their own. Almost overnight, Mara found herself shipped off to boarding school. Not because of money troubles, not because it was some carefully planned educational opportunity, because, as Mara pieced together over the years, Craig simply didn't want her around anymore. A living, breathing reminder of his wife's life before him. An inconvenience to be managed and minimized. And it worked. With Mara away at school for most of the year, and Craig firmly in control of the household, and, frankly, of Mara's mother's attention, Mara slowly got frozen out. Holidays got shorter. Phone calls got less frequent. By the time Mara was an adult, her relationship with her own mother had been reduced to birthday texts and the occasional stilted phone call, always somehow cut short before it went anywhere real. Here's the part that made it worse, though: Mara's mother knew. She wasn't oblivious. She carried real guilt about how things had turned out. Mara told me, more than once, that she could hear it in her mom's voice on those short phone calls, a kind of sadness that never quite had anywhere to go. But she never did anything about it. Never stood up to Craig, never made real space for her daughter, never fixed it. Guilt without action isn't much comfort to the person on the other end of it. So somewhere along the way, Mara gave up. Not out of bitterness exactly, more like self-preservation. She stopped expecting her mom to choose her. She built a life that didn't depend on her showing up. And that life, as it happened, became a private investigation firm, one that specialized, more than anything else, in catching cheating spouses. There's an irony in that, if you think about it. Mara spent her career handing other people the proof they needed to leave bad marriages, to reclaim their lives, to finally see clearly what had been hidden from them. She just never imagined that skill set would end up pointed at her own family. It was an ordinary morning. Mara and I were finishing up prep to leave town for a job, bags packed, equipment checked, the usual pre-trip scramble. Her phone buzzed. A Facebook message, from someone she didn't know. "Do you know Craig's name?" Mara almost didn't answer. In our line of work, random messages from strangers aren't exactly rare, and they're not always something good. But something made her respond. Maybe curiosity. Maybe instinct built from years of this exact job. The reply came back almost instantly. The woman explained who she was, a nurse, and, as it turned out, someone with her own recent history with infidelity. Her husband had been caught cheating a few months earlier. She didn't go into detail about what that had done to her, but you didn't need her to. Anyone who's been through it knows. And because of that, she told Mara she'd made herself a promise: if she ever came across something similar happening to someone else, she wasn't going to just look away. The night before, she'd been driving home from a late shift down a quiet country road when she spotted two cars pulled over, close together, looking like they might be broken down. Being the type of person who stops for that kind of thing, she pulled over to check if anyone needed help. She got out, walked up toward the back windows, and realized, pretty quickly, that these weren't two strangers dealing with car trouble. This was something else entirely. She didn't make a scene. She didn't knock on the window. She quietly took a few photos, got back in her car, and drove off, but not before running the license plates on both vehicles through a contact she had. What came back stopped her. 2 different last names. 2 different addresses. Not a couple. Not even close. So she did what she'd promised herself she'd do. She started trying to track down the families involved, to warn them the same way she wished someone had warned her months earlier. She couldn't find a wife associated with one of the names online. But she did find what looked like a daughter. That daughter was Mara. Now, put yourself in Mara's shoes for a second. A total stranger just handed her photographic evidence that the man who tore her family apart, the man who sent her away, who slowly erased her from her own mother's life, was cheating. Mara didn't scream. She didn't even really process it right away. What she did instead was something I will never forget as long as I live. Stick around, because what happened right after that message is the moment this whole story turns. I have worked alongside Mara for years. I've seen her handle every kind of case: messy divorces, ugly custody battles, clients breaking down in our office more times than I can count. In this line of work, you build a certain amount of professional distance from other people's pain, because you have to. I had never seen Mara cry the way she cried reading that message. But here's the thing, they weren't sad tears. They weren't even angry tears, not at first. They were the happiest tears I've ever watched someone cry. Because in that instant, Mara wasn't thinking about Craig's marriage falling apart. She was thinking about her mom. For years, Mara had quietly accepted that she was never getting her mother back. That whatever had been broken when Craig entered the picture was broken for good, and there was nothing left to do but manage the loss and move on with her life. And now, out of absolutely nowhere, a stranger, a nurse she'd never met, acting purely out of her own sense of decency after her own painful experience, had just handed her away back in. Real, documented, undeniable proof that the man standing between her and her mother wasn't the steady, dependable husband he presented himself as. Revenge, quite literally, had been dropped in her lap. And the cruel irony of it all was that this exact kind of revenge, catching a cheating spouse, documenting it, using it to change the course of a family's future, was how Mara paid her bills every single day. She had built an entire career around handing other people this moment. She just never expected to be the one receiving it. But as much as I understood the urge to act immediately, to call her mom that same hour, to drive straight to Craig's job, to do something, anything, right away, I knew better. And so did Mara, once the initial wave passed. We were professionals. And professionals don't move on emotion. They move on strategy. I made Mara sit on the information for 24 hours. I want to be clear about why, because I know how that might sound. It wasn't about doubting what we'd been shown. The photos were pretty unambiguous, and the mismatched names and addresses on those license plates only backed it up further. It was about making sure that when we did act, we acted the right way, not the fastest way. 24 hours doesn't sound like much, but in the middle of an emotional gut punch like that, it's an eternity. It gave us time to think clearly instead of reactively. It gave us time to plan instead of just react. We spent that day doing what we did best, thinking like investigators instead of like family members. What did we actually have? A tip from a stranger, and a handful of photos. Good starting evidence, but not necessarily bulletproof. What would we need if this went further, if Craig fought back, if it ended up in a courtroom, if custody of the younger kids became a real question? We also had to think about Mara's mom. This wasn't just about exposing Craig. This was about how we delivered this information to a woman who had spent years quietly grieving the relationship she'd let slip away with her daughter, without ever having the courage to do anything about the man she blamed for it, even if she never said so directly. We didn't want to blindside her carelessly. We wanted to hand this to her in a way that gave her room to actually process it, and, maybe more importantly, a real path forward once she did. So we made a plan. And the first step of that plan was lunch. Mara called her mother and asked her to lunch. Nothing unusual there, on the surface, but she also gave her a heads up that they needed to talk about something serious. Something difficult. I could tell, even secondhand, that she was nervous going in. Years of guilt tend to make people brace for the worst whenever a hard conversation gets scheduled, especially with a daughter they know they've let down. We sat down, made it through a little small talk, and then Mara slid the manila envelope across the table. She opened it. Looked through the photos. And here's the part that told us everything we needed to know about the state of her marriage, even before we said another word. She didn't look devastated. She looked relieved. Genuinely, visibly relieved, the kind of relief that comes from someone who has been quietly trapped in something for a long time and just discovered, out of nowhere, an exit they didn't think they had. She described her marriage to Craig, in that moment, in a way she clearly hadn't let herself say out loud before: absolutely abusive. Not just difficult, not just a rough patch, abusive, controlling, isolating, all the things you'd expect from someone Craig had already shown himself willing to do to his own stepdaughter. A stranger with a camera on a dark country road had just handed her an exit from a marriage she'd been too afraid, or too worn down, to leave on her own. At this point, you might think the plan was basically done, evidence gathered, mom on board, time to move forward. But Mara and I knew from years of doing this professionally that one lucky tip from a stranger, however solid, usually isn't enough if things get contested in court. So we made a decision that a lot of people found surprising when we told them later. We took the case ourselves. Here's something important about our line of work: a single tip, even a good one, isn't always enough on its own. If Craig decided to fight this, whether over the house, the finances, or worst of all, custody of his younger kids, we needed our own independently gathered, professionally documented evidence. Not just a stranger's photos and a license plate lookup, however credible. So Mara and I did what we did for a living. We put Craig under surveillance. Ourselves. Legally, properly, the same way we would for any paying client, except this client, for the first time in either of our careers, was family. It didn't take long to see the pattern. Craig, we learned, was an avid cyclist. At least, that's what he'd always told Mara's mom: hours-long bike rides, several times a week, his way of staying active and clearing his head. Nobody in the family had ever questioned it. Why would they? It sounded healthy, normal, even admirable. Except when we followed him, bike riding turned out to mean something else entirely. 3 days in a row, same pattern, almost suspiciously consistent, he'd head out with his bike, but the bike would end up locked to a rack somewhere while he climbed into someone else's car. Same route, more or less. Same general time frame. Same affair partner from the country road photos. 3 days of independently confirmed, professionally documented evidence. Enough that there was no reasonable way to spin this as a misunderstanding, a one-time lapse, anything but a sustained, ongoing affair that had apparently been going on for a long time, hidden in plain sight behind a hobby nobody ever thought to question. And every single time we brought a new detail back to Mara's mom, she had the same reaction, a kind of stunned recognition. "That's a regular thing, he does that all the time," she'd say, about some detail we'd just revealed was actually cover for an affair. Things that had seemed completely normal for years suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern she'd simply never had a reason to look at closely. 3 days was enough. We had what we needed. Once we had the evidence locked down, the next question was timing. And this is where the plan started to take on the same shape as so many of the cases we'd handled for other clients over the years, except this time, we got to build it exactly the way we would have wanted, for someone we actually loved. Craig had an upcoming business trip a few days away, which gave us a clean, contained window to prepare everything without him catching wind of it early. We picked the day he was set to return home as the day everything would happen. The logic was simple. We didn't want a slow reveal, an argument that dragged out over days or weeks while Craig had time to hide assets, manipulate the kids, or build his own narrative first. We wanted one clean, undeniable moment, evidence already gathered, decisions already made, nothing left to negotiate about the facts, only about what happened next. So while Craig was away, we got to work. We showed up early on the day Craig was set to return. Boxes, tape, a truck, the whole operation. And we packed up everything that belonged to him. Methodically, efficiently, the same way we'd pack up evidence or equipment for any other job. Mara's mom was there the entire time, watching her husband's belongings get boxed up and loaded, and by all accounts, she wasn't second-guessing a single moment of it. Whatever hesitation might have lingered after the initial shock of those first photos had long since burned off, replaced by something closer to determination. By the time we finished, the house looked almost unrecognizable, Craig's side of the closet cleared out, his things loaded into the truck, everything staged and ready. All that was left to do was wait. So we waited. All three of us, together, for the sound of his car in the driveway. This is the moment the entire story had been building toward from that very first Facebook message. A stranger's decency on a dark country road. 24 hours of careful planning. 3 days of surveillance. And now, a house full of boxes, a manila envelope, and a mother and daughter standing together, waiting for a car in the driveway. What happened next might be one of the most satisfying moments I have ever witnessed firsthand. Craig pulled into the driveway expecting to come home from a business trip to a normal house. Instead, he walked in to find boxes everywhere, a truck outside, and his wife standing there holding a manila envelope, with Mara standing beside her. And here's the detail that stuck with everyone who's ever heard this story. The second Craig saw that envelope in his wife's hands, and saw the look on his stepdaughter's face, he knew. Instantly. Nobody had to say a single word for him to understand exactly what was happening. He started shouting almost immediately. Not confusion, not denial at first, straight to anger, straight to blame. How could you do this to me, you little bit? He didn't get to finish the sentence. Mara cut him off, calm as anything, no hesitation at all. Easily. And happily. 2 words that took years, decades, really, of being shipped away, frozen out, and quietly erased from her own family, and turned all of it into the single most satisfying sentence Mara has probably ever said in her life. Once the truth was fully out in the open, the affair, the surveillance, the pattern going back who knows how long, Craig's position collapsed fast. Facing the kind of documented evidence we'd built, evidence that would hold up in any courtroom, Craig didn't put up much of a fight in the end. He gave up the house. He gave up full custody of his and Mara's mother's kids, choosing instead a life with fewer obligations and, presumably, more freedom to continue whatever it was he'd been doing on those bike rides without anyone watching. The kids, for what it's worth, didn't take it well, not the divorce itself, but their father's choices leading up to it. By the time everything settled, none of them wanted much of anything to do with him. That's its own kind of consequence, separate from anything a court could order. And Mara's mother, for the first time in years, found herself free of a marriage she'd been too afraid to walk away from on her own. She didn't need anyone to explain to her what had really been happening under her own roof anymore. She'd seen it in black and white, in photographs and surveillance logs, undeniable. Here's the part of this story that matters more than any of the drama, more than the shouting, more than even that perfect 2-word comeback. Mara got her mother back. Not instantly, not perfectly, rebuilding a relationship after that much lost time doesn't happen overnight, no matter how the marriage that caused the damage ends. But for the first time since she was a kid, there was nothing standing between them anymore. No gatekeeper managing her attention, no unspoken tension hovering over every visit, no boarding school keeping her at arm's length. Just a mother and a daughter, finally able to build the relationship that had been quietly stolen from both of them years earlier. Mara and I have handled a lot of cheating spouse cases over the years. We've seen a lot of people get their moment of truth, their proof, their exit door. I can honestly say, out of every single case either of us has ever worked, nothing came close to the feeling of watching my partner get her mother back. There's a lesson buried in this story that goes beyond the cheating, beyond the stepfather, even beyond that incredible comeback line. It's this: sometimes the people who hurt us the most do it slowly, quietly, over years, in ways that never quite look dramatic enough to point at and say that's the moment everything changed. And sometimes, the truth that finally sets things right doesn't come from years of digging. Sometimes it comes from a stranger, on a dark country road, who simply decided she wasn't going to look the other way. If you enjoyed this one, let me know in the comments, and tell me, would you have handed your mom that envelope at lunch, the way Mara did? Or would you have done it differently? Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, hit the bell so you don't miss the next upload, and I'll see you in the next video.